A bride who vanished from her own wedding, leaving behind whispers and an empty aisle. Welcome to Tea and Clue. I'm your host, Elias Thorne. Join the mystery. Drop your location in the comments. I treasure every message you leave. Let's begin. It was the sort of June day that looked as if it had been ordered in advance for a wedding. Mild sunshine filtered gently through high summer clouds, the roses around St. Faith's churchyard in full and fragrant bloom, and the soft buzzing of bees barely audible beneath the strains of a string quartet tuning their boughs. In the village of Little Witchwood, where nothing ever seemed to happen until it did, the air shimmered with that particular excitement only a local wedding can bring. Hushed gossip, the rustle of silk dresses, and the faint suggestion that perhaps something might go wrong, if only to make it memorable. Everyone who mattered had turned up. That, of course, included Miss Jane Marple, who had accepted the invitation with the same polite surprise she used when asked to play bridge, knowing full well that she was expected. She had tucked a pale violet pansy into her hat. A nod to sentiment, not fashion, she had said to herself, and taken her seat 3 rows from the back, a comfortable distance from both the altar and the scandal. The bride, Miss Philippa Dunn, was marrying Hugh Cartwright, the only son of the late Colonel Cartwright and his forceful widow, Edwina. Philippa was, as most said kindly, a little on the quiet side, though no one meant it cruelly. Pretty in an indistinct way, with pale eyes and a tendency to blush, she'd arrived in Little Witchwood scarcely 2 years before to take up a position as secretary companion to the invalid Mrs. Ada Reynolds of Wych Elm House. And then, to the village's private satisfaction, she had become affianced to Hugh, who was sturdy and tall and had returned from his time in Kenya with the air of a man used to being obeyed and praised for being modest about it. He ran the Cartwright holdings with efficiency and not much imagination, and while he wasn't quite what the vicar's wife would call an original thinker, he was certainly steady, and a marriage between them seemed the very model of common sense. At 10 minutes to noon, the pews were filled, the vicar stood waiting in his stall, and Hugh, looking slightly greenish but otherwise stalwart, adjusted his cuffs. The quartet had just begun a tentative rendering of Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, when a faint murmuring began near the church doors. "She's not in the car," someone whispered. "They're searching the vicarage garden. They say the dress is still on the hanger." The whispers rolled like a wave down the aisle, and Miss Marple, who had just opened her order of service, paused. She tilted her head slightly. It was not the delay that concerned her. Delays at weddings, tears, buttons unfastened, a veil that refused to settle, were common enough. No, what piqued her curiosity was the tone of the whispers, not anxious, not excited, but uncertain, as though people weren't quite sure what had happened. And uncertainty, in Miss Marple's long experience, was usually the prelude to something unfortunate. It was Edwina Cartwright who burst into the aisle, her broad shoulders straining against a dove-gray bolero, her mouth pulled tight and furious. "She's gone," she declared, eyes flashing as if she were delivering a court-martial sentence. "Vanished, taken herself off like some deranged schoolgirl." There was a gasp that ran down the rows, and then silence. Only the cellist in the quartet continued, producing a mournful thrum before he too lowered his bow. The vicar cleared his throat. Gone, Mrs. Cartwright? Are you quite sure?" "I've looked, Vicar. Nah, she was in the dressing room at the vicarage half an hour ago. Dress laid out, hair done. Then, nothing, just nothing. The back gates unlatched. Someone said they saw a woman walking toward the downs, but who in heaven's name walks away from their own wedding?" Miss Marple folded her hands primly over the service sheet and said nothing, but her blue eyes, mild as ever, had fixed on Mrs. Cartwright's gloves. They were twisted in her hand, and the right one bore 4 small puncture marks near the wrist, as if bitten or clawed. Most of the congregation had stood now, the ceremony forgotten. Murmurs rose again. Some insisted Philippa had been taken ill. Others muttered about nerves, cold feet, or a lover no one had known about. One woman, a minor poet from the next village over, whispered something about a tragic secret kept too long. But Miss Marple, as she rose slowly with the rest of them, felt a faint chill touch the back of her neck. Because if Philippa Dunn had simply fled from the pressure of the ceremony, then why had she left her handbag behind on the dressing table? Why were her walking shoes neatly arranged beneath a chair, and not, as one might expect in a sudden flight, on her feet? And why had someone quietly closed the vicarage gate after she was gone? It would be hours before the police were called, and days before they would do anything useful. But for now, as the congregation spilled into the churchyard and the roses trembled in the warm breeze, Miss Marple moved toward the gate with slow and thoughtful steps. She did not believe in vanishing acts. No, not at all. She believed in people, and people, in her experience, never disappeared without a reason. The roses had begun to wilt ever so slightly under the early afternoon sun by the time the guests began drifting away from St. Faith's. What had begun as an occasion of celebration had curdled into awkward milling about. Men fumbled with jacket buttons, women adjusted gloves or murmured vague consolations to Edwina Cartwright, who responded with clipped ferocity. She had taken up post just beyond the lich gate, issuing updates to anyone who approached, mostly in the form of barked denials. No, she wasn't the sort to be nervous. If anything, she was too calm, unnervingly so. No, there was no other man. I'd have seen to that. Yes, the police will be notified. Hugh is speaking to them now. Miss Marple had, with some quiet insistence, taken it upon herself to linger at the edge of the vicarage garden rather than follow the crowd to the village green, where the marquee and luncheon were still standing in absurd readiness. A few clusters of well-meaning guests had wandered there anyway, lured by trifles and champagne already uncorked. The vicar's wife, flustered, had begun to hand out sandwiches with the same awkward cheer one might offer during a wake. Miss Marple, however, was far less interested in salmon paste than in patterns. And what interested her now was the small dressing room in the east wing of the vicarage where Philippa had been last seen. She made her way there with a politeness so firm it rendered resistance impossible. The maid, young Jenny, cheeks blotched with emotion, let her in with a nod and a bitten lip. "It were all laid out for her, miss," the girl whispered. Dress hung up, shoes polished, even the veil had been ironed again this morning. Miss Marple examined the small, neat space. There was an arrangement to things here that suggested thoughtfulness. The hairbrush wiped clean, a dainty handkerchief embroidered with forget-me-nots folded beside a closed powder compact. No sign of haste, no open drawers, no toppled chair. The wedding gown, pale ivory and modestly cut, still hung from the brass hook on the door. A pair of satin slippers, unworn, rested just beneath. But what caught Miss Marple's eye was the small purse placed carefully on the edge of the chair, pale leather, clasp slightly tarnished, no longer than a handspan. She opened it delicately. Inside, a lace-edged handkerchief, a rose-petal pink lipstick, a tiny bottle of smelling salts, and a single key. A house key by the look of it, worn smooth at the edges. "Did she ever carry much else?" Miss Marple asked, glancing up. "No, miss," Jenny said, wringing her hands. "She was ever so tidy, everything always in its place, never one for clutter," she said. "She even pressed her shopping receipts, can you believe?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I can, my dear. One often finds that people who have had to keep secrets in their lives become very particular about order." Jenny blinked. "Secrets? Miss Dunn? Oh no, miss. She wasn't like that at all." Miss Marple said non-committally, and turned to the dressing table. A comb, a set of pins arranged in a shallow dish, and a small photograph frame face down. She turned it over. It was a picture of a woman, not Philippa. The woman was older, smiling faintly, her features sharp and lined, with a brooch fastened at the collar of her blouse. The name etched at the bottom of the frame read Ada R. Reynolds, Wych Elm House. It was, Miss Marple thought, the sort of photograph one keeps as a gesture, not as a comfort. Outside the window, a pigeon fluttered from the hedge. Miss Marple looked once more around the room, then thanked Jenny and stepped outside. She took the path that led around the back of the vicarage, where the small iron gate, painted white once upon a time, now hung slightly ajar. The latch had been loosened. Recently, too, she noted. The ground showed only one faint mark, a partial print in the dry soil. A woman's heel, most likely, but not the satin slipper. So Philippa had not come this way in her wedding shoes, nor, by the look of it, in any shoes intended for a bridal aisle. And yet she had left the house through this gate. "Gone walking on her wedding day," came a voice to her left. Miss Marple turned to see Reverend Popham leaning on the fence post, his expression apologetic beneath his weather-beaten brow. He was a man more fond of gardening than preaching, and the dirt beneath his fingernails proved it. "I suppose she must have been terribly frightened," he continued, lowering his voice, "though I can't fathom why. Hugh's a bit of a bore, yes, but steady enough. We all assumed the match was, well, comfortable. Comfortable arrangements are sometimes the least comfortable of all," Miss Marple replied gently. He nodded and scratched the side of his neck. "You think she'll be found?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that she did not vanish because she was afraid, or at least not in the way people imagine." He looked puzzled. "I mean," she added, "I think she planned to disappear. That takes a very particular kind of fear and a very specific kind of resolve." It was later that afternoon, as the village drifted between speculation and fatigue, that the police arrived, delayed by a miscommunication in the neighboring town, which had initially treated the report as a runaway bride and not a missing person. Inspector Crail was a tall man with an unfortunate mustache and the firm belief that village crimes were rarely more complicated than theft of chickens or a bit of domestic unpleasantness. He interviewed Hugh first, who appeared calm on the surface but answered every question with a visible tightening of the jaw. "No," he said shortly. "She didn't say anything unusual this morning." "She had no family," Crail pressed. "None to speak of. Parents died when she was 16. Grew up in boarding schools and lodgings. Moved about quite a bit before she came here." "You were introduced through Mrs. Reynolds?" "Yes. Philippa was her companion. We met during the spring fair. She was intelligent, reserved, a good listener." Miss Marple, who had quietly taken a chair in the drawing-room corner while tea was passed around, looked up at that. "I do wonder," she said softly, "whether anyone has asked Mrs. Reynolds about this, if Philippa had ever confided anything." "She passed, I believe, only last autumn?" "Yes," Hugh replied. "October, quietly, in her sleep. And left everything to Philippa," Edwina Cartwright snapped from the other armchair, eyes sharp with something between resentment and distrust. "Which, I dare say, is what started the whole ridiculous notion of marrying above her station." There was a pause. Crail, to his credit, said nothing. Miss Marple merely blinked. "Did Philippa speak of Wych Elm House fondly?" she asked. "No more than anyone might of a place where they've worked," Hugh replied, a touch too quickly. "Ah," Miss Marple said. "So not like home, then. Curious." The clock struck 4. Outside, a dog barked and was hushed. The police would begin a search of the fields that evening. They would find nothing. But Miss Marple had already begun to piece together the quiet oddities, the closed gate, the tidy room, the purse left behind with its contents so carefully arranged. The photograph of the woman who had left Philippa a house and a quiet inheritance, and perhaps more than that. Something invisible but heavy, a burden, a warning, or a secret. And she had also noticed that when the question of why Philippa might run had been asked, no one had said the word love, not even once. By the following morning, the entire village was coated in a fine film of speculation. The bakery ran out of oatcakes before 8. The postmistress had to repeat herself 3 times when handing out registered letters, her mind entirely elsewhere. Even the milkman, who had never missed a bottle, left 3 sitting by the Cartwright's side gate, forgotten in his haste to share the latest whisper with the grocer's assistant. Everyone had a theory, and not one of them sounded quite right. Miss Marple, however, was less concerned with the village's theories and more interested in silences. The gaps in conversation, the questions answered too quickly, and the ones avoided altogether. After her morning tea and a brief exchange with her canary, she set out toward Wych Elm House. The house sat slightly apart from the village, down a lane lined with gnarled trees whose branches bent over the road like conspirators. Though once grand, it bore the unmistakable air of a home that had been well kept only as far as appearances required. The paint flaked discreetly from the south-facing windows, and a curtain on the top floor hung slightly askew. The garden had been clipped, yes, but only in the front. Around the back, the weeds were beginning to show their heads. Miss Marple paused at the front gate, took a breath, and stepped inside. The house had been left to Philippa after Mrs. Reynolds's death, though Philippa had not moved in. That, in itself, struck Miss Marple as notable. In a village like Little Witchwood, such an inheritance would usually bring pride, even a degree of fuss. But Philippa had remained at the vicarage until the wedding. She knocked once. No answer. Then again, more firmly. The door opened a cautious inch. A face peeked out, thin, hollow-cheeked, with hair pulled back in a bun far too severe for someone so young. "Yes?" "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I was told Mrs. Reynolds' former housekeeper still resided here. I do hope I'm not intruding." The girl hesitated. "I was Mrs. Reynolds' maid," she said slowly. "Not the housekeeper. She never needed one, not in the last years." Forgive me," Miss Marple said with a little bow of her head. "I always find titles confusing. Might I have a word? Only a few minutes." The girl relented and opened the door further. Her name was Nora, as it turned out. 27, originally from Marlow, with a tiredness that didn't come from age but from long service under difficult silence. Miss Marple was shown into the drawing room, where the air still smelled faintly of old lavender and coal dust. She didn't leave the house often in the last year, Nora said when prompted. Took to writing letters instead. Miss Dunn always posted them. Miss Marple glanced at the writing desk by the window. Its lid was shut but not locked. Did Miss Dunn ever mention what Mrs. Reynolds wrote about? Number never. Just said they were private. But I did notice something odd the week before she passed. Oh. She burned a whole stack of papers in the drawing room fireplace. Sat there with her shawl drawn up, feeding them in one at a time. She said they were old bills, but bills don't usually make a woman's hand shake like that. Miss Marple's eyes twitched briefly. Indeed not. Nora rose and crossed to the desk. After she passed, I packed away her things. But Miss Dunn came back the next week and took a box of personal items, said it was for closure, never mentioned what was in it. Just a shoebox tied with blue ribbon. And she left it here. No, took it with her. Said she'd be back before the wedding to sort the rest of the house. But she never did. Miss Marple thanked her and walked home with measured steps. By the time she returned to her cottage, a new idea had begun to form. Later that afternoon, she visited the Cartwright estate, not to speak with Edwina, who was likely still sharpening her disapproval into fine needles, but with Hugh. She found him in the orchard behind the house, pruning with mechanical determination. He looked up as she approached and gave her a tight nod. Miss Marple, come to question the jilted man. Not at all, she said, settling herself on the low stone wall. Only to ask a few things I suspect no one else has thought to. Is that not the same thing? She smiled faintly. You and Philippa had known each other how long before the engagement? 15 months. And in that time, she never mentioned anyone from before? No, not even in passing. Cousin, perhaps. Or an old friend. She said she had no living family, and she didn't keep up with the past. I asked once, early on. She said the past was a corridor she'd locked from the inside. Her words. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. May I ask, Mr. Cartwright, did you love her? His shears paused in midair. His eyes did not meet hers. I thought I did, he said finally. And she accepted it. That is a very particular choice of words. She never gave much away, Miss Marple. You'd talk and she'd listen. She always knew what to say to make you feel clever. That sounds very lonely. He sighed and clipped another branch. She was like a photograph you find in someone else's attic. You don't know who's in it, but it's so familiar you convince yourself you must. Miss Marple nodded and stood. One more thing, if I may. Did you know she came into possession of Wych Elm House through a will made just 3 days before Mrs. Reynolds died? He looked up sharply. Number that can't be right. Apparently it is. And the will was witnessed by the vicar and Mrs. Delaford from the bookshop. Mrs. Reynolds left everything to Philippa and wrote in the margin, "My conscience is eased. Let her do with it what I could not." Hugh stared at her. "Do you suppose," he said slowly, "that Philippa came here not for marriage, but to escape something?" Miss Marple did not answer. She only looked at the far hedge, where a single white foxglove nodded in the wind. That evening, the police expanded their search. They combed the downs and the station platform. A boy reported having seen a woman near the pond at Blackbriar Copse, alone and without shoes. They found no trace of her, but Miss Marple, returning home by way of the meadow path, paused when she saw a footprint half obscured in the dew, pressed into the soft earth just beside the stile. It was a woman's foot, bare, and beside it the glimmer of something small and sharp, a pin like the kind used to secure a veil. Miss Marple bent slowly, her joints objecting, and retrieved the pin from the damp grass. It was delicate, silver-tipped, and curved just slightly with pressure, no longer than her little finger. Not the sort of thing to be casually lost by a rambler or a farm girl. This had once held something in place, something fine, perhaps a veil, perhaps something else. She tucked it carefully into her reticule, brushing her fingers once more across the soft earth where the bare footprint ended. There were no others nearby, just the one, facing west toward the dark outline of Blackbriar Copse. She straightened and looked up toward the treetops, where the fading light of day tangled itself in the branches. That a woman might walk barefoot through this terrain suggested desperation or determination, or both. But it was the direction that struck Miss Marple most. The pond was just beyond that wood, shallow and tangled with weeds. A local landmark, yes, but not one visited often, and never alone. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage, not to the Reverend, but to his wife, Margaret, who, though often dismissed as vague and fluttery, had an extraordinary memory for small domestic details. She found her in the garden, trying to coax snapdragons into bloom, and was welcomed at once with warm apologies for the state of the tea tray and the vicar's sudden craving for sardines on toast. "I do hope this isn't all too distressing for you," Margaret said, brushing crumbs from her apron. "It's just awful, of course, and Edwina Cartwright's taken to marching through the village like a general after retreat. But I can't help thinking, well, it does feel familiar." "Familiar?" Miss Marple echoed gently, stirring her tea. "Yes," Margaret said. "Something about it, about the suddenness of it. I don't know if you remember, but there was a girl once, in Barchester, this would have been 20 years ago, called herself Evelyn Hope, though it turned out that wasn't her real name at all. She vanished, quite publicly, just before marrying some solicitor. It made the papers. Only later they discovered she'd been living under an assumed identity, trying to escape a family scandal. She turned up in Italy with a different haircut and a new name. "How fascinating," Miss Marple said, her voice like spun silk. "Do you recall what the scandal was? Something to do with her brother? Fraud? Or possibly something worse? The point is, she vanished just like that. Slipped away like mist." Miss Marple considered this in silence. When Margaret rose to fetch more hot water, she allowed her gaze to wander across the room. The small alcove bookshelf was stuffed with village chronicles, gardening books, and a dog-eared index of births and deaths in the Witchwood parish. She took note of it and then turned back as Margaret returned. "I wonder, Margaret dear, would you happen to know whether Mrs. Reynolds ever received visitors in her final months?" "Very few. She had Philippa, of course, and the girl Nora. And once, just once, I believe someone came from London. A man, rather tall and unsmiling. He didn't stay long. Philippa fetched him at the station. I remember because it was raining that day and I lent her our large tartan umbrella. A tall man. Did you happen to catch his name?" "No, I'm afraid not. He didn't even take tea. But I do recall Philippa was quiet afterward. Pale. She didn't play the organ in church that week, and I remember thinking it was odd." Miss Marple smiled faintly and rose, thanking her hostess. By late afternoon, she had made two decisions. The first was to pay another visit to Inspector Crail, despite his rather bovine reluctance to consider anything outside the obvious. The second was to visit the solicitor who had drawn up Mrs. Reynolds's will. Mr. Lennox, an elderly gentleman whose office smelled of leather and dust, and whose habit of humming absently during conversations made him appear more forgetful than he actually was. Inspector Crail was not in the least pleased to see her. "If I may say so, Miss Marple," he said, puffing on his pipe in his office at the edge of the market square, "I don't quite see what purpose is served by stirring up further mystery. The young woman is missing, yes, but these things have a way of sorting themselves. Cold feet. Likely headed off to a cousin or a convent. Or a copse," Miss Marple murmured. "Beg pardon," I said. "Or perhaps she headed toward Blackbriar Copse. There was a footprint, just one, and a pin, the sort that would hold a veil or perhaps a comb." Crail frowned. "We've searched the area. Nothing." "Not thoroughly," she said, "and not with the assumption that she may not have intended to be found." He puffed harder. "Inspector," she said gently, "do you know the phrase conscience clause?" "In a will, yes. Means the person wanted to acknowledge something but couldn't state it plainly, usually to appease guilt." "Precisely. Mrs. Reynolds wrote, 'My conscience is eased,' and then gave the entire estate to Philippa. I think Mrs. Reynolds harbored a great guilt, and I think Philippa's disappearance is not the cause of a nervous breakdown or panic, but of a choice made long before her wedding day." Crail looked at her sharply, and for the first time since the case began, he did not immediately dismiss her. That evening, Miss Marple took a detour on her walk and passed Wych Elm House again. There was a bicycle resting against the gate. She paused. A young man emerged from the garden path a moment later, brushing leaves from his trousers. He looked up sharply and hesitated. He was tall, clean-shaven, city-made by his coat and shoes. "You're a bit far from the train station," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I'm looking for someone," he replied, curt. "Philippa Dunn. Do you know her?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said. "She was to be married last Saturday. She disappeared." The man stiffened. "She what?" "You didn't know?" I've been abroad. No one wrote to me." "You're a relative." There was the briefest flicker of a pause. "No," he said. "An old friend." Miss Marple smiled. "Well, I'm sure the inspector would be most interested to know that. He's just round the square. Do give him your name." Of course, yes, I will." He turned and left swiftly, wheeling his bicycle rather than riding it. Miss Marple watched him go, then stepped inside the gate. Near the front porch, beneath a windowsill, something white caught her eye, a crumpled bit of paper nearly buried in dirt. She retrieved it carefully. A torn envelope, half dissolved by rain, the corner of a postmark still visible. It read, King's Bench, Prison, London, and the name scrawled on the remnant of the return address was unmistakable. Done. Miss Marple folded the paper slowly, as if she were closing the lid on a long-forgotten box. So Philippa had a brother, after all, and he had written to her from prison. Miss Marple walked home with deliberate slowness, the crumpled envelope folded in her gloved hand, the faint weight of its revelation pressing evenly across her thoughts. Done. Not a cousin, nor a distant acquaintance, a brother. And not a theoretical one either, but a real man with a real past, his very presence written in the ink of prison correspondence, and now, it would seem, resurfaced in the form of a tall man asking after a sister who had disappeared. She boiled her kettle with steady movements, her mind unspooling threads. Why had Philippa never mentioned a brother? Shame? Protection? Or something older, deeper, like guilt? Or fear? She poured her tea and let it cool as she reviewed what she now knew. Philippa had received letters from a man imprisoned in King's Bench Prison who shared her surname. She had burned documents shortly before Mrs. Reynolds' death. She had inherited Wych Elm House under a will written 3 days before that death, bearing the odd phrase, "My conscience is eased." She had vanished on her wedding day, leaving behind an untouched gown, a house key, and a single footprint near Blackbriar Copse. There was something here that did not align with romantic flight or sudden nerves. Something woven into a family thread, frayed long before Philippa ever met Hugh Cartwright. Miss Marple suspected the brother's role in all this was not incidental. Whether he had come to her with a request or a threat, or merely a reminder of who she had once been, it had set something into motion that led to a bare foot in the meadow and a silver pin in the grass. By early evening, she found herself once again in Inspector Crale's office, this time without preamble. He looked up from his desk with a groan, but silenced it quickly when she placed the damp envelope before him. "You'll want to test the paper for fingerprints, I'm sure," she said mildly. "But it's the name that should interest you." He read the remnant aloud, brows knitting. Done. Related, you think?" "I'd wager heavily, yes." She never spoke of family, but the timing of the letter and her disappearance is suggestive. Crale scratched at his mustache. "We'll trace the prison records. See if he's out. Could be she ran off to meet him." Miss Marple's head tilted a fraction. Or to avoid meeting him again. She left him to it and returned home, where she took out her own notes, scribbled observations tucked neatly into a linen-covered notebook. Names, times, overheard phrases. Her eyes paused on the phrase Margaret Popham had used. A man from London, just once, just one visit, and Philippa had been pale afterward. The next morning, word came from Inspector Crale. Robert Dunn had indeed been released from King's Bench 2 months prior. Embezzlement, 6 years served. His file listed no known address, though a forwarding request had been made for mail to a boarding house in Finchley. Crale sent a constable to inquire. Meanwhile, Miss Marple requested permission to examine the attic at Wych Elm House. With Nora's reluctant blessing and a borrowed lantern, she climbed the narrow stairs late that afternoon. The attic had the dry, fragile scent of old paper and long-closed shutters. The boxes were labeled in Mrs. Reynolds' handwriting, mostly unremarkable. Receipts, holiday cards, clippings. But near the back, beneath a wicker hamper, was a metal trunk, dented and locked. Miss Marple didn't try to force it. Instead, she examined the space around it. There, beneath the frayed lining of an old rug, she found a tiny, yellowed envelope addressed simply, "To be opened in the event of inquiry." Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The first was a signed confession dated some 7 years ago by Robert Dunn, a clumsy forgery, clearly written under duress or in haste. The second was a letter from Ada Reynolds to her solicitor, never posted, stating that the confession had been coerced to protect someone else. The third was more troubling, a handwritten note from Philippa, unsigned but unmistakably hers, thanking Mrs. Reynolds for protecting the truth and expressing sorrow that she had not had the courage to speak when it mattered. Miss Marple sat on the low chest and folded the pages again with shaking fingers. So that was it. Robert had taken the fall. For something Philippa had done, or thought she had done, and Mrs. Reynolds, for reasons still only half glimpsed, had ensured the blame stayed buried. She returned to Crail with the papers. He was uncharacteristically quiet as he read them, the habitual cynicism draining from his posture. "We'll need to bring in this Robert," he said finally. "If he's here." "He was," Miss Marple said. "He asked after her in the garden just yesterday. Gave no name. Rode off on a bicycle before I could press him further." Crail's jaw tightened. "We'll circulate his description. Meanwhile, you say the pond in the copse was never fully searched?" "No," she said. "Not with the idea that someone might have entered it willingly, or with help." That evening, as the sky bruised with twilight, Crail assembled a small team with lanterns and dogs. Miss Marple followed at a distance, standing near the stile where the footprint had appeared. They moved through the bracken in slow sweeps. The air was still and damp, and the trees leaned over them with funereal silence. Then, from the edge of the pond, a shout. Crail himself pushed through the reeds. The others followed, lanterns flickering. There, tangled beneath a slick of waterweed, was the hem of a dress, pale gray. Not bridal, but familiar. They pulled the body from the shallows with a kind of grim reverence. It had been their days, preserved only by the coolness of the water. There were no signs of a struggle, no bruises, no bindings, but there, clutched in one hand, was a length of blue ribbon, not from a veil, from a shoebox. The very shoebox, Miss Marple suspected, that had once held a truth Philippa couldn't bear to destroy. And now she had chosen to disappear not from marriage, but from history itself. The news spread by morning, though not officially. Villages have their own organs of communication, faster than telegrams, more thorough than the wireless. By the time the milk float turned onto High Street, every housewife from the bakery to the bookseller knew that a body had been pulled from the pond at Blackbriar Copse and that it was a woman's. Within an hour, it had become the woman's. And by noon, it was Philippa Dunn again, spoken of with hushed reverence, as if death had scrubbed away all their previous speculations and replaced them with something purer and less complicated. But Miss Marple did not forget, nor did she mistake silence for peace. She sat with Inspector Crail in his office that same morning, watching him read through the coroner's early notes. His brows moved in shallow ridges as he read, twitched, tightened, then relaxed. "No signs of a struggle," he said, half to himself. "No injuries, clothing consistent with the time of disappearance, and the ribbon in the hand." "Suicide?" Miss Marple offered gently. He hesitated, then rubbed his temple. "It's the simplest explanation, and one I'm inclined to accept, given everything. But not the correct one." He sighed. "You don't believe she walked into that pond herself?" "Oh, I believe she intended to disappear," Miss Marple replied. "But intention alone doesn't mean she wasn't helped or hurried." Crail looked up at that. "You mean murdered?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, choosing her words with care, that she knew something she could no longer carry, something she'd buried, first with silence, then with the aid of Mrs. Reynolds, and finally by handing over that shoebox. But if someone discovered what was in it, or worse, who it implicated, then perhaps she never had a chance to finish what she'd begun. Crail sat back and folded his arms. "And Robert Dunn." "I don't think he killed her," she said. "I think he came to collect what he believed was owed to him. And when he found out it was gone, he disappeared just as quickly. What you must ask, Inspector, is this: who else knew about that box?" That question hung in the room like dust in light. Later that afternoon, Hugh Cartwright returned from the police station, looking 10 years older. His hands were shaking. Edwina followed 2 steps behind, mouth tight, her entire posture rigid with the effort of not collapsing into either grief or gloating. She had always said Philippa was too calm, too quiet, too opaque. Now it seemed death had rendered her right and unsatisfied. Miss Marple called on them at sunset. She found Hugh in the library, staring out over the orchard, untouched drink in hand. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Whatever else she was someone you meant to trust. He didn't respond for a long moment. Then, "Do you think she loved me?" "I think she wanted to. And I think she believed that marrying you would redeem something." "Did she kill herself?" Miss Marple considered that. "No," she said at last. "I believe she stood on the edge of that pond and hesitated. And I believe someone met her there." He turned sharply. "Who?" "Someone who needed her silence more than they needed her love." Miss Marple rose, patted his hand, and left him there in the lengthening dusk. The next morning, a message arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, handwritten in a tidy, nervous hand. It read, "Miss Marple, there is something I should have said sooner. Please come." Nora Witch Elm House had not changed overnight, but something in its atmosphere had. The doors opened reluctantly. The garden sagged under its own weight. Nora met Miss Marple at the threshold, pale and tight-lipped, and led her into the back sitting room. "There was something I found after she left for the wedding," Nora said, holding out a small bundle. "I didn't know what to do with it. I thought it might upset people. But now..." It was a bundle of letters, tied not with ribbon, but string. Miss Marple opened the first. It was from Robert Dunn, written in a scratchy, uneven hand, pleading for money. Not demanding, pleading. But what caught her attention was the postscript on one. "He says he'll tell them if I don't. That I was there. That I saw what she did." She read it twice. "She?" Miss Marple asked softly. "He didn't mean Philippa." Nora looked down. "I thought he did at first, but then I remembered something. Something Philippa once said in passing. We were sitting in the kitchen and she looked at the mantel where Mrs. Reynolds kept that ugly clock. And she said, 'It's funny, isn't it, how people think the worst things stay buried. But they don't. They learn to breathe underground.'" Miss Marple nodded, very slowly. "She was talking about Mrs. Reynolds, wasn't she?" "I think so." Miss Marple placed the letters carefully back in the string-tied bundle. Her mind worked now not in theory, but in confirmation. Mrs. Reynolds had protected Philippa. That much was clear, but not just from scandal, from something darker, something that implicated Mrs. Reynolds herself. She stepped out into the garden where the light broke through the hedgerow just enough to cast the grass in warm gold. She remembered the old woman's photograph on the dressing table, the tight mouth, the wary eyes. A woman who had likely known guilt for most of her life and had spent her final years orchestrating silence. She looked at the knot of blue ribbon still in her own handbag, the one recovered from Philippa's hand. She imagined the shoebox it had once tied and the documents within it. She imagined a moment on the bank of the pond, a final confrontation, someone arriving with a question Philippa could not bear to answer, or perhaps someone who already knew. The next step was not dramatic. Miss Marple simply went home and wrote 2 letters. One was to Inspector Crail, urging him to re-examine Mrs. Reynolds' financial records, particularly payments or withdrawals made in the months leading to her death. The second was addressed to Mr. Lennox, the solicitor, requesting access to Mrs. Reynolds' personal file, especially any prior versions of her will. Within days, both replies arrived, and they confirmed everything. Mrs. Reynolds had altered her will twice before the final revision. In the first, dated 2 years prior, she left her estate to a charity for injured war nurses. In the second, dated 8 months before her death, she added Philippa as joint beneficiary, contingent on no scandal or inquiry. But in the final version, that clause was removed entirely. Why? Because someone, likely Robert, had written from prison, threatening exposure, and Mrs. Reynolds, racked with guilt, tried to make peace by leaving everything to Philippa, a final act of penance. But someone else didn't want that peace. Miss Marple studied the ledgers. In the last 6 weeks of her life, Mrs. Reynolds had made 2 significant withdrawals in cash. One was unaccounted for, the other was deposited quietly into an account under a different name, a name that belonged to Nora's mother. Miss Marple returned to Wych Elm House once more. She asked for tea, waited until they sat, and then gently said, "Dear Nora, what exactly did your mother do for Mrs. Reynolds before she passed? Besides cook and clean?" Nora's hands trembled slightly. "I think," Miss Marple continued softly, "she did something more permanent. I think Mrs. Reynolds asked for mercy, and your mother obliged. She waited." Nora didn't speak, but her eyes filled. "And I think you've kept her secret, just as Philippa did, just as Mrs. Reynolds hoped." Then very quietly, Miss Marple added, "But secrets, dear, do not end with silence. They end when someone chooses to speak." And in the hush that followed, a single tear rolled down Nora's cheek, landing on her skirt like the final drop of a long-held storm. Nora didn't confess. Not in so many words, but confession was never the point. Miss Marple knew the difference between facts and truth. One could be offered to the police, the other had to be coaxed, understood, sometimes simply accepted without ever being spoken aloud. And so she sat with the girl in the fading light of the Wych Elm House sitting room, neither pressing nor withdrawing, as Nora wept quietly into her hands. Outside, the garden continued its slow collapse into evening. The house seemed to exhale. When the tears subsided, Nora looked up, her voice thready. She didn't want to go into hospital. She was afraid of dying there, alone. She was in pain all the time, even when she wouldn't admit it. She said she had made so many choices out of fear and didn't want to die afraid. Miss Marple nodded gently. "And your mother helped her?" Nora looked away. "She told me only after. She said Mrs. Reynolds had left everything in order, and that it wasn't our place to speak of it, that it would only hurt people. Philippa especially." "It wasn't just mercy, though, was it?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm, her eyes never leaving Nora's. "It was also because of what Mrs. Reynolds had kept hidden, what she was running from even in her final weeks." Nora hesitated. Then, "Robert came once. I saw him. He and Mrs. Reynolds argued. I didn't hear what was said, but afterward Philippa locked herself in her room for hours. When she came out, she asked for the shoebox, the one with the letters. Said she needed to decide." Miss Marple drew in a breath and let it out slowly. She never did decide, poor child. Not entirely. She wanted to believe it could be forgotten. But such things never are. Nora rose then, shaky but composed. She brought a small parcel from a drawer and held it out, wrapped in brown paper, bound in twine. "I think this is the last of it," she said. "I didn't want to open it. I think it's from Philippa, left here before the wedding. I found it tucked behind the old armoire in her room. It has your name." Miss Marple accepted the parcel and, with her usual meticulousness, untied the string and peeled back the paper. Inside was a letter, a faded photograph, and a slim journal. The photograph showed 3 young people, 2 women and a man, standing before Wych Elm House in the bright, careless sunshine of long ago. One was unmistakably Mrs. Reynolds in youth. The man, standing between the women, was smiling. And the third figure, barely more than a girl, had Philippa's eyes. She opened the letter next, dated 3 days before the wedding. Dear Miss Marple, I don't expect you to forgive me, nor do I expect you to understand fully, but you have always seemed to know more than you should, and I suppose that's why I write this. In case I disappear and no one knows why. In case silence feels safer than truth. Mrs. Reynolds was my aunt, not by blood, but by accident. My mother died young, and Ada was the one who stepped in. Begrudgingly, I think. She raised me in part out of guilt. Her brother, my real father, had done something during the war that was never spoken of. A scandal that nearly ruined them. She believed secrets were safer than justice. That was her lesson to me. Silence protects, but silence doesn't protect. It decays. I let Robert go to prison to preserve the illusion of who I was becoming. He wanted money to disappear. I almost gave it to him. But the truth stayed lodged in me like a splinter. Hugh doesn't know me. No one really does. I've left the past behind in that house. In boxes, in drawers, in photographs, with faces I can't look at anymore. I don't know what I'll do next, but if I don't come back, please, please, don't let people believe it was cowardice. I just couldn't carry all of them anymore. Yours, P. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. Her eyes were dry, but her throat was tight. She reached next for the journal, its spine cracked, its pages fragile with wear. It was filled with short entries, written in fits and starts over several years. There were fragments of memory, scraps about life with Ada, fear of her moods, gratitude that bled into resentment, and always a recurring line. I wanted to be someone new, but I brought the ghosts with me. Miss Marple closed the journal. The next morning, she went to Inspector Crail once again. She handed over the journal, the photograph, the letter. She explained nothing, only said, "This should be kept with her name." Crail, to his credit, asked no questions beyond the necessary. He promised it would be filed quietly. He understood finally that justice in this case would not arrive by way of courts. Philippa Dunn was buried 3 days later in the old churchyard behind St. Faith's. There was no large ceremony. Only Hugh, the vicar, Nora, and Miss Marple stood beside the grave. Edwina did not attend. Her silence, for once, was appropriate. After the earth was filled, Hugh placed a single white rose on the headstone. His hand lingered on the cool stone. "She never belonged to us," he said quietly. "Not really." Miss Marple stood beside him, her eyes thoughtful. "Number, but she tried, and trying counts for something." He nodded, then turned and walked away alone. The village returned to its rhythm within the week. The gossip softened, then faded. The marquee was finally taken down. The bakery went back to baking. Life went on as it always does, patching over the cracks until only those who lived through them remembered where they had been. Miss Marple, back in her cottage with her canary and her tea things, wrote one final note and slipped it into the back of her book of pressings. Philippa Dunn, loved in silence, buried in peace, known at last. And then she turned the page, as gently as one might close a window on a storm that had, at last, passed through. Rain fell 2 nights later, soft and persistent, tapping at windows and pulling the scent of soil up from the garden beds. In the grey hours of early morning, with the village still wrapped in sleep, Miss Marple stirred in her armchair and glanced toward the hearth, where the fire had long since gone to embers. She had not intended to drift off, but the pages of an old novel lay folded across her lap, and her reading spectacles were slightly askew. The letter from Philippa had been reread twice before her eyes had closed, and now, on waking, its words returned with fresh weight. She rose stiffly, set the teacup aside, and crossed to the small table by the window. There, beside the morning's untouched crossword and the trimmed tulips, was a second envelope, this one addressed in a broad, unfamiliar hand. It had been slipped through her door in the night. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet, unsigned. There is one more box. I couldn't bring myself to burn it. The shed, behind the rose trellis. I'm sorry I waited so long. N. She stared at it for a moment, then reached for her shawl. The walk to Wych Elm House was damp but quiet. Rain had softened the lane and slicked the hedgerows. The house itself loomed under the mist, its windows blind and streaked. Nora was not in sight. A bird called once from the upper chimney stack, then fell silent. Miss Marple moved to the side garden where the trellis bowed under the weight of the climbing roses. Behind it stood the shed, low-roofed, sagging slightly at the hinge. The door was not locked. Inside, beneath a shelf of rusted tools and rotting tomato boxes, was a small wooden trunk, not large, but sturdy. It bore a brass latch, untarnished. She opened it. Inside were items that did not belong to Philippa, or not entirely. A man's cufflinks, a faded theater program, a folded handkerchief embroidered with a simple RD, and beneath them another envelope, this one sealed with red wax. She broke the seal. To whomever finds this. If this is being read, then I've done what I could not avoid any longer. I did not kill Ada Reynolds, but I knew what she did. She let my mother die. I was 10. I heard the argument. I saw her leave. And when she came back, there was silence. Years later, when she took Philippa in, I thought perhaps it was atonement. But no. She made Philippa pay for the secret too. She made her carry it in silence, the way she had forced me to. I never meant to hurt her. But I needed something. I needed it to stop. I told Philippa I'd stay away if she gave me what Ada had left her. I didn't know she'd break under it. I didn't know she'd go to the pond. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for truth. Robert Dunn. Miss Marple folded the letter with trembling hands and sat on the old milking stool beside the trunk. The walls of the shed groaned faintly in the wind, and through the cracked slats came the smell of rain and rose stems. So Robert had come. He had tried, in his own twisted way, to end the long pattern of silence, but too late. Philippa had carried the weight to the water's edge and found no footing. Miss Marple returned to the house, where Nora waited at the front door, pale and dry-eyed. I didn't want it destroyed, she said quietly. I told myself it wasn't mine to keep, but it wasn't mine to burn either. You did the right thing, Miss Marple said. Perhaps the only right thing left to do. Later that day, she handed the letter to Inspector Crail. He read it in silence, then placed it in an envelope with the rest of the materials in the case. No charges? He asked, almost rhetorically. No, Miss Marple replied. Only memory. He nodded, and there was no argument. Not this time. 2 weeks passed, then one more. Spring softened. The roses bloomed with quiet fervor. The village tilted forward into summer. Hugh Cartwright came to call. It was late afternoon, and Miss Marple had just returned from pruning her delphiniums. I wanted to thank you, he said, for seeing her. She was never invisible, Miss Marple replied. Not really, only disguised. He nodded. His coat was dusty from the road, his face thinner, more lined. I've decided to sell the orchard. I'll keep the cottage near the downs. I don't want to live in a house with empty chairs. Miss Marple offered no protest. He did not ask for sympathy, only silence. They sat for a while, watching the kettle boil, saying little. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door. Do you think she'd have stayed if I'd known her better? No, Miss Marple said gently. But I think she might have told you the truth, and that would have been a very fine thing. He left, and Miss Marple returned to her chair, where the final letter sat beside her saucer. She read it one last time, then placed it with care into her scrapbook, between a pressed pansy and a faded newspaper clipping about a Barchester bride who had vanished and reappeared in a Florence boarding house. She closed the book. Some stories, she thought, do not end with justice or vengeance or triumph. Some end with a quiet naming of pain, and that, too, is a kind of resolution. Outside, the roses bowed in the breeze, as though listening to a truth at last spoken aloud. The days that followed drifted with a peculiar stillness. The village, having exhausted the mystery with its usual appetite for detail, had fallen back into its rhythms. Quiet walks to the shops, gossip over fences, hymn practice at St. Faith's on Thursdays. The hedges had grown a little fuller. The tea shop returned to offering lemon scones, and though the name Philippa Dunn still echoed faintly in certain conversations, it had taken on the softened tone reserved for stories too complex for blame and too sad for embellishment. Miss Marple continued her routines as before, her walks, her rose pruning, her endless correspondences and gentle vigilance. Yet there lingered a thread still unknotted in her thoughts, one she returned to late at night when the fire was low and the air was thick with stillness. It wasn't guilt or dissatisfaction. No, Miss Marple had long since learned that closure often arrived not in a final word, but in a quiet understanding. It was the matter of intention that would not let go. She returned one morning to Wych Elm House, summoned, not by note this time, but by instinct. Nora met her with a hesitant smile, not quite surprised to see her. "I've started packing the upstairs rooms," she said. "It feels strange, folding up someone else's life." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet we all do it sooner or later, if not for others, then for ourselves." They walked together through the narrow hallways, past half-emptied bookshelves and a wardrobe from which mothballs spilled like faint ghosts. In Philippa's old room, the dressing table had been cleared, the drawers emptied, the curtains taken down. She kept a journal, Nora said softly, as if revealing a secret again. "But you saw that already." "Yes, but it wasn't what she wrote that troubles me." Nora glanced over. "It's what she didn't write," Miss Marple continued. "Philippa was meticulous. Quiet, yes, but careful. Her entries ended the morning of the wedding with a line that struck me even then. If I walk away, I must not look back. And yet, I wonder if she meant to walk away at all. But she left the room, the veil, the shoes. She left without those things, yes. But what woman prepares everything so carefully, even the way her bag is packed, only to vanish with nothing at all? She took nothing except, perhaps, the shoebox. And even that she left behind in the end." Nora was silent. Miss Marple turned slowly to the window, where sunlight spilled across the sill in clean gold. "I believe she planned to meet someone that morning. I believe she meant to hand over the truth, to place the past in someone else's hands and start her new life as herself. Not as Ada's ward, not as Robert's sister, as Philippa Dunn, and something went wrong." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "something went wrong." They walked in silence down to the garden, where ivy had begun to reclaim the edges of the flagstone path. The rose trellis bowed now under the weight of rain and bloom, and the scent of overripe petals drifted thickly in the air. Nora stopped. "Do you think Robert killed her after all?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Number, not in the way you mean. I believe Philippa's death was the end of a slow unraveling, but not at Robert's hands alone. I think the deeper wound was laid long ago, by Ada, yes, but also by the choices Philippa made to protect everyone else from the truth. She never protected herself," Nora whispered. Miss Marple turned to her. "Number, but she tried in the end, and that's what matters." That evening, a small package arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, tied in plain brown paper, no return address. Inside was a single object, a pressed violet sealed behind glass, with a note, "For the one who saw me clearly. Thank you. P." Miss Marple held it for a long time in her lap, one hand lightly on the glass. She knew it was Nora who had found it, tucked perhaps inside one of Philippa's books or hidden between drawer linings. But it felt like it came from further away, from a place where pain no longer had to hide behind silence, where Philippa had finally put down what she carried. She set it on the mantel beside her photograph of her cousin Eliza, the one who had died at 20 from influenza and whom no one but Jane had truly understood. That night, she made herself a cup of warm milk and sat in the dark, watching the stars rise. Some mysteries were solved with arrests, with statements and signatures and headlines. Others ended more quietly, in folded letters, in garden paths, in the glint of a single silver hairpin buried in grass. Philippa Dunn's story was the latter, and for Miss Marple, that was enough. 2 weeks later, with the sun gently warming the village roofs and the hedgerows thick with bees, a letter arrived that for most would have seemed entirely ordinary. It bore a London postmark, cream envelope, no return address, neatly addressed to Miss Jane Marple, St. Mary Mead. The script was unfamiliar, but something in the curve of the M struck a chord before she'd even broken the seal. Inside were only 2 sentences. "You were right about the box. Thank you for not naming me." There was no signature. Miss Marple read it once and then again, letting the quiet of the room settle around her. She folded the note carefully and placed it beside the pressed violet on the mantel. She did not need a signature. The writer had made their peace, or tried to. That same afternoon, Inspector Crail came to call. He was not a man prone to courtesy visits, but he carried himself with a reluctant gravity that suggested unfinished business. Miss Marple greeted him with her usual calm and led him into the sitting room, where tea was already steeping. "We received word from Finchley," he said, not waiting for the cup she poured. "About Robert Dunn. He's gone." "Gone?" "Left the boarding house without notice, paid 2 weeks in advance, no forwarding address." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "He will not return." Crail glanced toward the window where the wind stirred the lace curtains. "You don't believe he'll contact the authorities again?" "Number, he's done what he came to do, which was to free himself from guilt by giving it to someone else." The inspector looked at her carefully. "You still think he didn't push her into the water?" "I know he didn't. Philippa made her choice. But it wasn't suicide in the ordinary sense. She stepped into the pond not out of despair but as a final refusal, to be shaped by the silence of others. It was the only form of speech she had left." Crail sat for a long moment, then picked up the cup she had set before him. "You should have been a magistrate." "Oh, no," Miss Marple said, a little smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "Far too many rules. I prefer gardens. They reveal things more slowly." He left shortly afterward, the envelope tucked into his coat pocket, the case closed but not forgotten. Outside, the roses had begun to fall in their final flourish, petals curling at the edges, perfumed and faintly brown. That evening, Nora walked to Miss Marple's gate and paused there, hat in hand. She didn't ask to come in. Miss Marple joined her on the bench beneath the elder tree. "I've decided to leave Wych Elm House," Nora said, not looking at her. "There's a position in Hampshire, companion to an elderly widow, not unlike what Philippa was once. She would have understood. I think she might have warned me away," Nora added with a flicker of a smile. "But I can't stay there, not with the echoes." Miss Marple touched her hand gently. "Places hold memories, but they don't demand them. Sometimes walking away is not escape. It's permission." Nora's eyes filled but did not spill. "I never told anyone what I saw, not even Mother. "And perhaps you didn't need to," Miss Marple replied. "Not all truth is spoken aloud. Sometimes it waits for the right soil." When Nora left, Miss Marple returned inside, where the day had faded into its softer version. The fire was lit low, the windows aglow with evening. She sat at her writing desk and opened her scrapbook once more. Beneath the last note from Philippa, she pasted the newest letter, the unsigned one, and beside it, a clipping from the Daily Chronicle. "Mysterious disappearance of man, once convicted in embezzlement scandal, last seen near Southampton Port." There would be no arrest, no further investigation. Just another slip into shadow, a quiet vanishing not unlike Philippa's, though born of different intent. Miss Marple leaned back and watched the candlelight flicker against the pressed petals above the page. It was not a clean ending, but it was, in its way, a complete one. She rose, watered the violets on the sill, and checked the latch on the front door. Outside, the village slept beneath the stars, unaware that the final chapter of a long-buried story had finally closed. Or perhaps not unaware. Perhaps it simply knew better than to ask too many questions in a place where silence was the most common form of inheritance, and where, just once, a woman had chosen to speak by vanishing. Miss Marple folded her hands and smiled, and then, as always, turned out the light. It was a week after Nora left Wych Elm House that Miss Marple made her final visit there, not out of necessity, but for ceremony. The house stood hollow now, its windows empty of curtains, its steps swept clean by someone trying to show care without memory. The ivy had begun to reclaim the stone arch near the gate, and in the corner of the overgrown garden, the rose trellis leaned slightly to one side, as if bowing under the weight of what it had witnessed. Miss Marple walked slowly along the gravel path and paused by the sundial, worn and moss-touched. She had no need to search for new clues, no suspicion left unresolved. Instead, she stood to take in the quiet, to mark the final shape of the story that had twisted itself through so many lives. There had never been a tidy villain, no dramatic confrontation, no moment of theatrical guilt. Instead, the mystery had unfurled as so many true ones did, through layers of fear, protection, misunderstanding, and the long, slow ache of secrecy. Philippa Dunn had not fled from love, nor run from guilt. She had walked willingly into the quiet, her final act one of relinquishment. Not surrender precisely, but release. She had tried to keep everyone safe, even Robert, even Ada. She had tried to contain the truth so completely that it would disappear with her. But in doing so, she had become invisible herself. And in the end, it was that invisibility that Miss Marple could not forgive. Because someone had to see her. Someone had to name what had really happened. Miss Marple had followed the signs that others missed not by cleverness alone, but by watching people in the way gardeners watch weather, knowing when something is blooming too early or when a root grows in the wrong direction. She had noticed that Philippa's disappearance lacked panic, that her preparations had the careful choreography of a woman about to perform, not flee, that she had left behind her shoes, her gown, her purse, but not the shoe box, because it wasn't vanity she was abandoning, but illusion. The letter from Robert had confirmed what Miss Marple had already suspected. Ada Reynolds had once made a decision that scarred 2 lives. One child she had turned away and left to be buried in grief and silence. The other she had raised with that silence braided into her very nature, twisting Philippa's sense of duty into a binding knot. Robert had tried to untangle that knot too late. Nora's mother had been part of Ada's final mercy, a quiet collusion that blurred the lines between kindness and crime. And Hugh Cartwright, honorable but blind, had loved a version of Philippa that she had outgrown long before the vows were written. The truth had not been one crime, but many small ones, layered and quiet. It had grown in the dark until it had nowhere left to go but down into the pond. Now the truth rested in letters tucked away in a solicitor's vault, in a pressed violet on Miss Marple's mantle, in the silence of a girl who had finally left the house that had held too many secrets. Miss Marple turned from the garden and made her way home. That evening, she poured herself a cup of strong tea, lit the fire, and sat down at her writing desk. She opened her scrapbook one final time and, on a clean page at the end, wrote in her firm, clear hand. Philippa Dunn did not vanish. She stepped into the light, and in doing so, revealed all the shadows. She closed the book, and with it, the case, 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 the case.